I'm Carol Costin, and I've been asked by the Portfolio Advisory Board team and board to share some of my reflections as probably the oldest living board member of PAB, since I've been on the board since 1975 and have served in several capacities. I chaired the board for 11 years. I was executive director for 3 years, and I've been on the Alternative Investment Committee since 1985. And it's a good sign that you can see that I'm still upright, so that being on the PAB board is not dangerous to your health. When I thought about what my experiences have been being on the board, I thought back to my own evolution during the 60s and the early 70s, and I was very much influenced by the civil rights legislation activity, the struggle with the Vietnam War, being involved in a group of sisters that were working for social change in Florida. And so when I was asked in the 1971 to come and start Network, it seemed like it was part of not only my personal evolution, but where the congregation was heading. And when I was supported in starting Network by Rosemary and the other members of her council, it was in a way in line with where the congregation wanted to move. And so in 1974, when we were looking at our chapter enactments, we had already been influenced by the birth of a lot of organizations that looked at social change, such as the Campaign for Human Development, the National Organization of Women, the National Women's Political Caucus, Common Cause, Network, the National Association of Women Religious. And through all this ferment, people were starting to look at not only doing charity, but trying to work for justice by changing systems. And what was interesting, I had forgotten, but in 1974, when we had the Network seminar that summer, 22 Adrian Dominicans were there. And they had come to participate in the Network seminar, 2 or 3 of whom were delegates. And I can remember we sat on the porch of our little house over near Catholic University, and we talked about our hopes and dreams for that chapter. And we talked specifically about 2 enactments or 2 directions that we knew had bubbled up really in several parts of the United States. One was the whole justice goal, or judging what we do by the justice criteria, and another was looking at a way of monitoring our investment portfolio, which was a new idea for us. And so when the chapter passed that, I was very happy about it. And so in I think it was around November when I was asked to be on the board, I immediately said yes, because it fit in with what we were doing in terms of legislative change and Network, and here was a way to talk about systemic change through our portfolio. And so we had been nominated, I think, from around the country, and then the General Counsel appointed the board, as it has ever since then. I'd like to talk a little bit about how we functioned during that first year. When I went back and read the enactment from 1974, one of the things that amused me, besides saying we needed to set up a committee and we had to have it as a way to look at how we do our investments and have some criteria, and it said, what is the time frame? And had this little phrase, as soon as possible. And I thought that's been so typical of Adrian's. I mean, why didn't we do it yesterday? And so as soon as possible meant that we had our first meeting, I think it was about January 19th in 1975, and that was an educational meeting, and it was not only the PAB members, but other people in the finance and other offices. And then in February, when I looked at what we did in February, it pretty much set the stage for the way we functioned a lot since then. And that is, we set up a very full agenda of work in between meetings. We outlined short-term goals, medium-range goals, long-range goals. We had timelines, and we had who would do it and by when. And we met again in April, and by the time we met in June, we'd already gone to shareholder meetings. We had already done proxies. We had already started to collaborate with some of the Protestant groups in ICCR, and we'd already explored ways of doing congregational education. And then we met again in October. So as far as I could tell, we met 5 or 6 times that first year. So we tried to do our work as soon as possible. As I reflected on the 16 years, I tried to pick out what I thought were consistent things that we had done, or consistent values. And I think the first one is collaboration, that ever since the beginning, the PAB has collaborated with other groups. I mean, that very first meeting in January of '75, we had others come in and teach us about corporate responsibility. And early on, we started working with the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, which is an organization of Protestant and Catholic groups based in New York with whom we still collaborate. And that gave us access to a lot of research, but more importantly, to a lot of people that shared our values, women and men from other religious congregations, from Protestant groups. And so when I think about the second aspect, which is you have to be in for the long haul to do this, one of the reasons I could stay in for the long haul is because of the friendships and the support that I've gotten from people not only on the PAB board and within our congregation, but through other congregations coming out of the ICCR experience. And we really have to be in for the long haul, because when I think about shareholder activism, that it was approximately 17 years ago that they had the very first resolutions about getting out of South Africa. And it's only like just today, in fact, in 1991, that we're starting to see some of that structure of apartheid being dismantled. And it has been being dismantled because of the courageousness of the black leadership and the black people there. And in addition, it's been helped by international pressure, which I think the religious congregations can take justifiably a lot of credit for pushing since early on in the 70s with resolutions asking corporations to get out of South Africa. And so when you see just that one aspect has taken 17 years and it's still not finished, then I think we realize how it's going to take a long, long time to change, or at least to make a little more just the kinds of economic systems we operate under. The third thing is, flowing out of this long term, is that we recognize we are a very tiny voice trying to make change in very large structures. I used to use the analogy, I felt like we were little flies in sort of the ear of the elephant, and that the corporation was the elephant, and although the fly couldn't really hurt it, it could certainly irritate it to death. And I think that when we would come to shareholder meetings, that's what we were. We were just like an irritant. And eventually we went away because the meeting ended, but during that time and prior to it, we agitated the executives enough that sometimes changes were made just to really get us to leave them alone. And in order to keep up faith and hope in this being such a tiny voice against such large needs, I think we've had to develop what I call a sense of the absurd, because I mean, here we are, a congregation of 1,300 women, and we're working with other congregations, but we're up against the whole corporate structure, not only in the United States, but internationally. And yet, if we can remind ourselves that we're like those little flies, then I think we can keep going. I think the other thing we absolutely have to have is a sense of humor. You just have to see really how ridiculous a lot of this is, and understand that humor is sort of God's gift to us social activists, that if we don't have humor in the midst of all this grimness, you know, we're pretty dreary to be around. And PAB has never been dreary. And I think one of the reasons is that we've had a real dedication to parties, at times to have wonderful wine tastings when Maureen Fenlon would bring things in from California, to have a lot of music and a lot of laughter. And we took the time to do that. I think the other thing that's been important is we've always taken the time at every meeting to share with each other. And that is that get beyond just the busyness of the kinds of works that we do into what's been moving us, what have been things that have been inspirational in our life, what have been sorrows we've had to bear. We've been with our women on the committee when they've had deaths in the family, and when they've had jobs that didn't work out, or when they've had sicknesses and so on. And I think that to me, one of the reasons that the PAB has been so enriching is that we have developed real strong friendships and bonds between and among the women on the board. A fourth theme, I think, is that we are always striving for consistency. And that is, the PAB was formed because we wanted a consistency between what we were saying on the one hand about justice and about not being in a negative way involved in third world countries. The other side of that was in what were we doing with our investments. And so we've been trying to say the mission statement ought to influence how we deal with our financial managers and our investors, and to search for that consistency. When we started to do alternative investments, it was how do we take the values that we have in our mission statements and say to groups that we want to be in a borrowing partnership with, do you have these same values? And then we're willing to be in partnership and have you use our money to do the same kind of things that we are trying to do in other arenas. And similarly, we would like to operate on the board in a way that's consistent with what we ask corporations to do, and that is to have a sense of mutuality, a sense of stewardship, to operate more out of cooperation and not out of competition. Another aspect would be to give information so that our own women, who may not ever come to a shareholder meeting, but they can be involved in boycotts. So when we've been able to do something like the Shell boycott or some of the infant formula activities or some of the ones on Coca-Cola, it was a way to say, all right, you make choices as consumers. And what you're doing when you have your school become, say, a Coke-free zone, or you don't buy Taster's Choice coffee, or you don't buy Campbell's soup, or whatever the boycott was, in a way you're being consistent with your own life choices in terms of buying with what the PAB is trying to do in your name for the whole congregation. A fifth theme, if you will, is the leadership role that members of the PAB have been able to take because of the congregational support in other organizations. For example, we've always been active in the Interfaith Center and Corporate Responsibility. I was chair of it for a few years. Maureen Floric has been the chair of the Clearinghouse on Alternative Investments. We've been one of the groups that you can always count on to do several shareholder resolutions a year. We've given talks all over the United States, members of the PAB, particularly to other religious congregations. As they've started to evolve their boards, we've been able to share our information. And I know that in the PAB office, Fran, and before her, Marion Gedeke, constantly got calls from other congregations saying, send us your criteria, send us how you organize your board, send us your alternative investment proposal forms. And I think it's a real credit that the Adrian congregation is willing to allow us to be volunteers in these organizations. A really important, consistent situation for me has been the role of the General Counsel and the role of the Finance Office relative to the Portfolio Board. And I think it's been a real example of shared leadership and shared authority. I mean, we serve at the invitation of the Council. We are an advisory board. And it's been in that role that we've been able to say to the Council, we want to make these alternative investments, we want to divest of these stocks, we want to buy these stocks. And the Council has been so supportive and so affirming, and in a way has said, we trust you, and we will let you make these choices in our name. And I think the information flow that's been helped, because we've always had a General Counsel liaison on the board, has assisted that. But it's never been like we've got to convince them of this. I mean, the Council has always been convinced and supportive of the PAB, and I treasured that. And in a similar way, I think the relationship with the Treasurer and the Finance Office has been somewhat unique, because I've heard stories at the ICCR meetings where the Social Justice or the Investment Committee people had to fight with the Treasurer to get information on stocks or to divest or to do alternative investments. And we have always had extremely collaborative and supportive relationship with the Finance Office. I know throughout the years since '74 we started talking about justice, there's been a question about what does it mean to have an option for the poor, what does it mean to have a justice criteria by which we judge everything. And I think what PAB has been able to do is to be a real structural option for the poor, so that the work we do with alternative investments, which now are up to 2 million, started with 100,000, is a consistent way to choose to be in partnership with the economically poor, whether it's with housing or developing small businesses or supporting credit unions. And it also gives us a way to be a voice for the congregation with corporations whose policies are really very detrimental to women and men in third world countries, with whom our sisters are also collaborating in a local level. So it brings a loop around of a structural option for the poor. Finally, I think a very important experience has been that the members have affirmed us. That is, we've had shareholder meetings with Adrian's in attendance ever since the beginning. I think probably as early as 1974 and 75 surely. And we've also had the affirmation of the general chapters. And as a board member, that has been very important to me, that each year in 78 and 82, 86, the chapter has said, we support what you're doing we reaffirmed the board, and in addition, we want you to put some money into alternative investments. That was the first time in '78. The next time it said put some more money in, and then again it was like we'd like to endorse even more money into alternative investment. And that's very important when you're doing so much volunteer work for the congregation on a board like this, to know that it's been affirmed and appreciated. I'd like to say something to those of you who are now on the board about, I guess, the opportunities that I think the board represents for you. And that is to be as creative as possible and to be as flexible as possible. When I look at this manual now, it looks so sophisticated and so organized, and all the details are there. And I have to remember that when we met in 1975, we basically started out with a blank sheet of paper and fairly blank minds on this subject. And it was only in the process of learning by doing. And so one of the things that I think has been most encouraging about the PAB is that we've affirmed each other to say, all right, none of us knew how to do this at the beginning, but we go to the meetings, we start learning, we share information, and we adjust. And when I look at the criteria now, it's different from what we did in '75. We shifted it a little bit in '81. We've now gotten it perhaps a little tighter based on the experience. And it could change entirely in another few years. And I think the point is to be flexible to what are the needs at this time. And I think when the board decided to really push at the '78 chapter for alternative investments, it's because we had been fairly frustrated by doing just shareholder resolutions. I mean, we had faithfully gone to lots and lots of meetings, and we had put proxies in, and we'd written letters to corporations. But we realized that this is not energizing to only do shareholder resolutions, because you get such small response. You might get 2% of the vote, or 3%, or if you're really lucky, 5%. And it's hard to get your mind around that being a huge success. And so I think the movement then to push for alternative investments came out of the experience of knowing we have to have more for ourselves. And then we started with 100,000 and moved up. And each time we learned, and we've made mistakes. We made loans that we won't do now. We've made loans that we're very proud that we made, even though they might have lost money. I think the relationships and what we learned have made it worthwhile. And I guess that's the other point I want to make, is be willing to take a risk. I mean, this whole board has been a risk from the very beginning. And if we had all said, well, we can't do this because we don't know anything about it, it never would have come into being. And the first time that we went to, anybody's gone to a shareholder meeting, it's scary. I mean, you risk people hissing at you, as they did at me at the General Electric meeting in Boston. You stand the risk of somebody turning the microphone off on you. You stand the risk of being really an unacceptable person in the minds of the guests at this annual meeting. I think when we make alternative investments and we feel this great responsibility to the congregational resources, we take a risk. But remember that the congregation has said do this. And it's not that they said just do the things that are absolutely safe and secure. They're saying, in our name, create partnerships with the economically poor. In our name, go to these meetings. In our name, go and struggle with executives about what's going wrong with their policy. And so I'd say don't be afraid, to take a risk, and don't be afraid to change. And just remember that you've got 1,200 or 1,300 women, in a sense, kind of wrapped around you as you do this kind of work, that we're going as a part of a larger. And I'm often reminded of that song that says, for each part is a part of each other's part. And that's really what the PAB is. It's just part of the Adrian Dominicans in action. I think the story of the Portfolio Advisory Board's involvement with Gulf and Western is a really good example of several things that I've been trying to share with you. First, it began with a request by our sisters who were in the Dominican Republic. Some of them, as we know, are native Dominicans, and others have gone down and to serve the people. And they said to us on the PAB and to the General Council, we don't like what we see Gulf and Western doing. I mean, the way that they were misappropriating land to use for their own goods, and taking the best farmland and putting it into hotels, not paying their workers working in bad conditions, not having housing, health care, and so on. And so the women asked us if we would do what we can to start investigating. So as early as the summer of 1975, we had purchased stock in Gulf and Western. I think we got 10 shares, and since then it's doubled, and I don't know, probably tripled by now. And so we started writing letters and setting up meetings with the executives of Gulf and Western. And several members of the PAB have worked on this over the years. I know that Meg Andrasik went to the Dominican Republic. I think Marilyn Uline went to some of the meetings. I made 2 field trips to the Dominican Republic and attended. I'd like to just talk a little bit about the one trip that I made that was organized by Margot Ruiz and Annette Sinagra, and I met also with Luisa Campo while I was there. And that was an attempt to really see all sides of the situation. And our women in the DR had arranged that we would meet with sugar executives, executives of Gulf and Western. We would meet with the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. We met with peasant organizations. We met with labor unions. We met with people who had worked there in education and so on, and really tried to see the whole picture. But I was most moved by going into the barrios and really seeing where the workers had to live. It was a terrible experience in that I was only there for a couple hours, and the conditions were so deplorable. I mean, you would go into little houses that if you put your arms out like this, they touch both sides. And in this one tiny little room, there were beds for 6 men. No places to leave their clothes or anything like that. Very hot and humid. There was one faucet, like between, it looked like maybe 20 of these buildings that was working. And that's where they got some water to try to use, and they had to cook outside. The bathrooms were absolutely filthy, and only a few had running water for showers. And again, I mean, the ratio was maybe like 2 showers and 400 people or something like that. It was just very inhumane kinds of living conditions. And it had just rained. There were no outdoor lights. I mean, we were slogging our way through mud with a flashlight and so on. And in this case, the Haitian workers really were treated the worst because they were just brought in almost like indentured servants with some deal between the sugar companies and the Haitian government. And the amount of health care was so minuscule, and we could never find out what the pay scales were, and we couldn't find out what policies they had about housing and so on. And that was an ongoing struggle over the years. But the thing that really got to me after listening to the workers and listening to the labor union people and seeing the conditions in which they lived, I then went to Palm Beach, Florida to attend the annual shareholder meeting of Gulf and Western, and it was in the Breakers Hotel. I don't know if you know anything about Florida, but the Breakers Hotel is one of the oldest and most elegant, most expensive hotels on the East Coast. It's right on the water and had this huge this big window that the people sat on these wonderful chairs on this parquet floor, and they looked out and saw the seagulls and the Atlantic Ocean. It was a beautiful sunny day and so on. And I was there, and Nancy Sylvester and IHM had gone with me to the Dominican Republic, and we were there to present what we had seen. And the contrast was just so disorienting to remember where the workers lived, the conditions in the fields, and then to see where the shareholders were. And I knew, as much as I tried to be persuasive, they were never going to be able to understand that how their money in this corporation was being used and how, in fact, it was abusing the rights of workers and so on. And when we tried to talk, the chairman of Gulf and Western was very irascible, and he got very upset, and he was literally yelling and giving me a lecture while I stood there in the middle of the floor about what right did we have to come in and talk about this, because after all, didn't we know that Gulf and Western had set up a fund, a foundation that they gave money away in the Dominican Republic. What we had found out when we were down there, that they had also not paid taxes, and they had the same amount of money that was put in the foundation was in fact what they owed in taxes, and there seemed to be some consonance between that. And then he also said, which I thought was an interesting comment, Gulf and Western had asked this bishop to head the foundation, so he was able to make a lot of decisions about the dispensing of the money and so on. And the chairman of Gulf and Western, his sort of last remark to me was, "I don't know why you sisters keep coming in here and bothering us with this kind of information at our annual meeting." He said, "I know there are plenty of elected church officials that support what we're doing, and I can get them to come to next year's meeting." I thought, no doubt.